On that base isolated by cold and oblivion, where the rigor of hierarchy was as cutting as the wind that blew through the iron hangars, everyone knew who was in charge, everyone knew who obeyed, and everyone knew who she was. But they knew it the hard way. Through her lack of importance, she was the youngest, the quietest, the most fragile in the eyes of those who only recognized power in loud voices, broad shoulders, and a past full of battle scars. She had no medals, no distinguished ranks, no tales of bravery that spread from mouth to mouth in the mess hall, just a clean record, a too discreet gaze, a presence that crept through the shadows, almost as if apologizing for being there. It was easy to ignore her, as easy as closing a room door and not even noticing she was left outside. When superiors discussed strategy, she listened, but wasn't heard. When soldiers made behind-the-scenes jokes, she was present, but wasn't noticed. Eyes passed over her, as if she were just part of the furniture. When she spoke, they called it shyness. When she was silent, they called it weakness. And when she made a mistake, she was remembered for days, unlike the others, whose mistakes were covered up by camaraderie or convenient oblivion. In the dormitory, her bunk was the last in the row near the creaking door. In training, her time was consistently mediocre, not bad enough to be dismissed, but never good enough for praise either. Her footsteps didn't echo. Her name was rarely spoken with respect, only murmured occasionally in cynical tones by those who whispered, "Why is she still here? Who brought her up? She doesn't have the right background." But what no one realized was that behind that silent posture, something was being built. While others swelled with pride and repetitive rituals she observed everything, learned everything. Every detail of the systems, every overlooked access, every map her superiors didn't see the need to review, she studied. Every behavior of her colleagues, every language flaw, every weak point in the chain of command. She listened more than she spoke, and in the silence she assembled her invisible arsenal, but even so she remained an easy target for scorn. In the cafeteria line, she was the last to receive her salary. In maintenance tasks, she was always remembered first, as if her only purpose was to accomplish what no one else wanted to do. In physical training, the instructors mocked her lightness, her physique, which seemed inadequate for carrying burdens or weapons. She was too small, too young, and most importantly, no one could remember the last time she had asserted herself. It was as if the system itself kept her there as a reminder of what not to be. And the cruelest thing about it all was the consistency. The contempt was subtle but daily, the glances that strayed from her as if she weren't worthy of meeting someone of a higher rank, the orders that came with tones of impatience as if giving her instructions were a waste of time, the times they addressed her only by her title without a name, without a face, and when they got her name wrong, because yes, that happened, she didn't even correct them. Because he knew that to them it didn't matter. Only one person in that room saw something different. A middle-aged nurse who once told her, "You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to wait for the right moment, and it always comes." She didn't respond, but she kept those words in her pocket like someone hiding a match in a world covered in ice. She was invisible, but not useless. And on this base where everyone vied for attention, where high-ranking officials occupied the center of conversation with glorious stories and bravado, she preferred to be in the corner, with a small notebook where she scribbled structure diagrams, patrol schedules, loose passwords she heard in the hallway, security codes she saw being typed by the distracted. She memorized them, not because she was planning anything, but because it was all she could do to avoid disappearing forever. Learning was her way of existing, and yet if you asked the other soldiers about her, they might say, "That one, the fragile one? Oh, the girl who never says anything? I forgot she was there." But the truth is, she was. She always was. And she was increasingly aware, stronger inside, more filled with details that no one else bothered to notice. Because sometimes the only difference between weakness and strength is the right time to act. And she knew that time, sooner or later, would reveal who was standing on merit and who was just shouting too loudly to hide their fear. If you've made it this far and believe that someone's true value lies not in the noise they make, but in the quiet strength they carry. Then like and subscribe now, because the story you're about to hear will turn everything upside down and perhaps change the way you see the people around you. Comment below with just one sentence. Have you ever been underestimated for being too quiet? She didn't talk much, in fact almost never, but her every silence was an active listening, a mental record, a strategic data collection. While everyone shouted orders, became agitated, argued among themselves, and allowed themselves to be dominated by the ego of a false protagonism, she remained motionless, her eyes alert, her ears open, her posture almost submissive, as if she didn't want to take up any space. She was seen as weak, irrelevant, just another obscure figure in the base's corridors. But what no one knew is that, precisely because she wasn't noticed, she had become the most dangerous observer of all. Behind the scenes of invisibility, she engineered her survival and, more than that, her rise. When her superiors scorned her, she didn't take offense. She paid attention. Every harsh word revealed the speaker's insecurity. Every impulsive gesture betrayed more than it seemed. She didn't retort, but mentally noted. Who exploded under pressure? Who flouted protocol? Who got drunk in secret? Who forgot to lock the armory doors? Everything that was overlooked out of arrogance, she silently catalogued. Her discretion was her cloak, her armor. While others thought they were ahead because they spoke louder, she preferred to listen, but not superficially, like someone feigning attention. She listened like someone deciphering. The hallway conversations, the whispers in the cafeteria, the loose comments during practice, everything was reading material. She didn't need to ask questions, because she already knew almost everything. And what she didn't yet know, she was close to discovering. Because unlike the others, she wasn't distracted by vanity. She was present, focused, awake, in permanent vigil mode. During meetings, while others tried to appear intelligent, she studied the maps hanging on the walls, the passwords accidentally scribbled in forgotten notebooks, the uncomfortable looks of those hiding something. When they left, she was the last to leave, and in this strategic solitude, she memorized the codes carelessly left exposed, the routes drawn on the whiteboards, the alerts flashing on secondary systems no one else checked. The base was full of secrets, but she was full of attention. And so it was that day after day she mapped every corner. She knew which corridors were ignored on patrol, which doors had faulty sensors, which cables were poorly connected to the generators. She knew which guards slept on night shift, and which officers were under investigation. Even if no one had commented directly, she understood the silences too. What was left unsaid, to her, was even more revealing. She had a gift for reading the voids, and this made her an invisible threat to all who underestimated her quiet intelligence. Her memory was photographic, but her strategy was analytical. She didn't just retain information, she cross-referenced it, connected it, identified patterns. She knew the captain only showed up at the armory when he was receiving visits from his superiors. She knew the motion sensors on the east side failed on very foggy days. She knew the lab in room 4 was empty on Wednesdays, and that the access code always changed on the last day of the month. While others lived in the now, she lived one step ahead, all this without saying a word. And why didn't anyone suspect? Because she had masterfully chosen the role of extra. The way she tied her hair, her uniform always fitted to the rules, her low voice, her minimal gestures, her downcast gaze when called upon, it was all part of the invisible performance. But behind this facade lay a calculating, patient mind, trained by life never to trust easy applause. Every snub was a sign that her disguise was working, and she was grateful for it. Soldiers used to say, "She has no presence." But what they didn't know was that the absence of presence was the greatest presence of all. Because where strength is not expected, it accumulates silently. Where courage is not expected, it builds deep. And where reaction is not expected, there lies the most dangerous counterattack. She was like a shadow. She could not be grasped nor wounded. She could only be felt too late when it was already inevitable. She became so adept at absorbing everything that once during a break-in simulation, she was the only one who, without consulting a single panel, knew exactly which door to lock, which route to take, and how to activate the manual security mode. When asked how she knew, she smiled that slight smile of someone who isn't surprised by their own efficiency. She simply said, "I paid attention." But what she really meant was, "While you were preoccupied with being visible, I became the hidden brains of this structure." In the eyes of most, she was just another unremarkable soldier. But the truth is, in times of crisis, she was the entire map, and whoever holds the map in their hands has the power to guide or sabotage. She didn't want revenge, nor medals. She simply wanted to be ready when no one else was, and that moment was getting closer. Comment with one word: who really observes in silence prepares what? It was at the very second everyone thought they had control of the situation that everything collapsed. The shrill sound of the emergency siren cut through the silence like a sharp blade. No one knew for sure what had happened first, whether it was the roar from the power station or the deafening crash of the metal structures breaking in the central hangar. But one thing was certain: the collapse gave no warning. It simply arrived like a wolf in the dark and tore through the base's routine with panicked claws. The commander, always haughty, experienced, and self-assured, attempted to take over containment protocol. But before he could issue a complete order, an explosion threw him against the concrete wall. His body fell inert to the oil and smoke-stained floor. The leader's fall was more than physical. It was symbolic. It was as if, in that moment, the base's heart had stopped beating. The nerve center had shattered. The soldier's eyes, once trained to follow commands without hesitation, now roamed in confusion, searching for any sign of direction, any ray of authority that remained in that disfigured scene. The lights flickered. The gas leak alarm sounded. The communications system fell into absolute silence. No radio, no terminals, no way to request reinforcements or coordinate evacuation routes. The previously orderly environment transformed into a jungle of instinct and desperation. Soldiers shouted contradictory orders. Others crouched over their commander's body, unsure whether to try to revive him or simply weep over their helplessness. A chemical fog began to spread through the corridors. A bittersweet metallic smell invaded everyone's nostrils. It was impossible to know the source of the leak, whether it was sabotage, a technical failure, or an indirect consequence of the initial impact. But the effect was real and immediate. Some began coughing uncontrollably, others felt dizzy. Emergency masks, locked in secure compartments, seemed to be inaccessible precisely when they were needed most. Psychological chaos took hold like a virus. No one could discern what constituted real risk and what was simply fear. An armed soldier collapsed and turned his gun on his own comrades, shouting that it was all a trap. He was forcibly disarmed, but the scene was enough to shatter the fragile collective trust. The ranks dissolved. Roles were reversed. Generals looked like recruits. Veterans trembled like civilians. And time, that invisible enemy, was running out. A timer began to flash on the security panels, indicating that in less than 20 minutes, the main system would automatically lock down. This meant locked doors, sealed corridors, and a death seal for anyone not at the correct evacuation point. But where was the map? Who had the coordinates? The command tower operator had disappeared, possibly in a panic or swallowed by the rubble of one of the collapsed rooms. The anguish of not knowing where to go was more severe than the risk of explosion itself. The base had been built to withstand external attacks, but no one expected the collapse to come from within. And precisely for that reason, there was no plan. There was no rehearsal. What remained now was the brutal reality of every man for himself, except for the few who still had the discernment to understand. If there was no immediate leadership, everyone would die. But who would dare to stand up in the vacuum left by the commander? Who would have the courage to give orders when fear had already taken root in the bones of everyone present? One group tried to force their way through the main exit. Another argued about going through underground maintenance tunnels, and there were those who simply knelt and began to pray aloud, surrendering their lives to fate. But psychological collapse had already overcome most. It was visible in their eyes. The lack of focus, the fixed stare, the cold sweat, the ragged breathing. When the mind surrenders, the body merely survives. At the end of one of the far corridors, an auxiliary control room still had power, but no one had noticed. No one even remembered it existed. and ironically, it was there that the only chance to coordinate evacuation and partial lockdown reversal remained intact. But everyone had forgotten about it, except one. Comment hook. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seemed to be falling apart and no one knew what to do? Tell us in the comments if you were the one who panicked or the one who remained calm. Silence. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but the suffocating presence of the unknown. It was in that instant that time shattered. A second before, orders were still being issued on the radio, steps were coordinated, plans were being executed. A second later, everything fell apart. The explosion was dry, but the impact echoed like thunder in everyone's eardrums. Black smoke rose like a curtain of despair, hiding faces, obscuring routes, swallowing certainties. The ground shook, alarm screamed, but no one heard anything else because fear screamed louder. And in that grey landscape, no one knew what to do. The base, once solid and secure, became a maze of scattered voices, contradictory commands, and dead-end corridors. Trained men stumbled over their own steps. Shouts rose from all sides, but none were clear enough to lead. Sirens wailed out of sync, as if they had lost track of their own protocol. One tried to open the emergency exit, while another yelled for everyone to get down on the ground. A third was already running in the opposite direction, trying to save what he didn't even know could be saved. It was naked, undisguised chaos. Smoke seeped through every gap, every crack, every crevice, and with it, an animal panic. It was as if the air was being stolen in small portions until breathing became a luxury for the few who weren't already kneeling or fallen. The walls of the base seemed to narrow, suffocating, folding in on themselves. Equipment flickered with electrical failures. Lights flickered without pattern. The ground, once firm, now slipped under the weight of its own collapse. And in the midst of it all, there were eyes watching, eyes that had not yet been noticed. She was there, still, silent, invisible. Not because she was hidden, but because no one else could see beyond their own despair. She saw everything, every senseless movement, every frustrated attempt at control, every leader who tested by the unexpected, dissolved before responsibility. While everyone else ran, she remained still. She observed, she recorded, she analyzed. There was no arrogance in her gaze, only lucidity, a lucidity that hurt. Because seeing clearly amidst chaos is a burden few can bear. It was curious. The one who had been ignored, underestimated, overlooked in training and missions, was now the only one who hadn't lost her way. While the more experienced soldiers wasted time debating whether to evacuate or resist, she already understood that the problem ran deeper. The base wasn't just under attack, it was crumbling from within. Not from the explosion itself, but from the lack of direction, the absence of a firm voice amidst the collapse, and that voice hadn't been heard yet. She walked through the rubble as if she'd already memorized the route. He knew where the air ducts, the control panels, the safest shelters were, but she didn't run. She didn't scream, she didn't despair, because inside her a flame burned that didn't come from training, but from pain, from exclusion, from the memory of every time she'd been disbelieved. And now, in that moment when everything stopped, she was the one who saw the most, who felt the most, who could act the most, if she were allowed to. But permission wouldn't come, because they still didn't see it. They were still too busy shouting orders that no one obeyed, trying to appear strong while fear trembled at the corners of their mouths. Time stood still, as if the universe held its breath, waiting for someone to burst the bubble. And she was about to. But at that moment, not yet. Because she knew, true impact doesn't come with force, it comes with precision. And the right moment was still forming. So she waited. For one more breath. For one more hesitation. For one more failure in the system everyone believed infallible. Because in a collapse, those who survive aren't the strongest. They're the most awake. And she was awake, more than ever. The chaos didn't scare her. It merely confirmed everything she'd always known. Most leaders only know how to command when everything is under control. But true leadership is born when control disappears. And in that moment when everything stopped, she was the one who began to breathe differently. With a calculated step, She headed toward the spot no maps marked but which her memory knew well. Her every decision was silent but precise, because while everyone else sought salvation outside, she knew the only possible way out lay within. And it was in this inner silence that she prepared what no one expected, her next move. What about you? Have you ever stopped to think if in the event of a collapse, you'd be just another person running in circles? Or someone who observes before acting? Comment here. If the world collapsed right now, what would your first reaction be? The scream wasn't just a sound. It was a rupture, a violent cut through the veil of cowardice that covered every face within that base. It was as if a storm had been sucked into a single lung and released back into the world as a command. A thunderclap coming from someone many hadn't even noticed until then. But in that instant, all heads turned. All conversation ceased. Time bent before the only thing that dared move, her voice. It wasn't hysteria. It wasn't desperation. It was precision, control, refined courage. It was the kind of scream that didn't demand attention. It demanded it. She screamed not to summon help, but to wake those who had already given up fighting. That sound didn't come from an ordinary throat. It was as if the bones of the past had broken again there, and now, in the echo of pain transformed into strength, she spoke for all the times she had been silenced. The metal structure of the ceiling reverberated as if it too had been touched by the order. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend she wasn't the one at the center, that she wasn't the one who now, with the simple vibration of her vocal cords, dominated the field. No trained general could have done better. And perhaps that was the secret unease in the souls of the superiors who heard it, because her cry wasn't just strategy, it was instinct, the purity of someone who doesn't hesitate in the face of chaos. And that's where the invisible power reveals itself. While some memorize orders, others are born ready to lead without a draft. She didn't need to justify herself. He didn't use technical terms, nor did he invoke rank. The cry was enough. It was like a spark in a reservoir of apathy. In seconds, the room reshaped itself. Previously confused faces lit up with direction. Previously paralyzed limbs began to move. Because when true authority speaks, fear falls silent. Each syllable was measured without her thinking. It was as if an ancient force had taken possession of her soul, a force that came from the silence she had endured her entire life, from the invisibility she had been forced to accept. Now, all of this emerged like lava, ready to reshape the surrounding landscape. And no one dared interrupt, because suddenly, even the most arrogant recognized something they would never admit aloud. She was born for this moment. It was with that scream that the chain of command broke. Not by rules, but by truth, by presence, by the emotional dominance she imposed without lifting a finger. She didn't need to. Her voice was the baton, her presence was the uniform, and the fear of others turned into movement, into obedience, not forced, but voluntary. Because there is something sacred in leadership, born of suffering. She knew exactly what to say because she knew every face there, every weakness, every limit. And because of that, her scream cut deeper than any official order. It was as if she had pulled the world back to the present, as if she had reconstructed reality from a simple phrase spoken with soul. Those who had previously mocked now followed. Those who doubted now acted. Because there, in that moment of urgency, everyone saw clearly who was made of words and who was made of action. Her scream revealed, exposed, freed. There was no tremor, no insecurity in her body. She stood firm. And that was frightening, not because of the brutality, but because of the calm. It was the serenity of someone who has seen the worst and chosen not to give in. Someone who screamed not out of fear, but to rescue. A woman invisible until then, but who, by speaking out firmly, dismantled the entire hierarchy. Because in extreme situations, titles turn to dust, and instinct becomes decree. The impact was immediate. Within seconds, everyone was in position. Even the resistors, the skeptics, those who used to laugh in the shadows now followed orders without blinking, not because they were convinced, but because they were defeated. Conquered by the magnetism of someone who didn't ask for respect, but forced it. A respect that came not from fear, but from admiration. That scream, more than a sound, was a milestone. A before and after. And although there are no medals for those who tear through inertia with their soul, there in that exact second, she received the rarest of recognitions, the absolute silence of the base. The silence that only occurs when everyone knows they are facing something that cannot be replicated. And then, without waiting for validation, she acted, as if I'd done it 1,000 times before, as if she'd always been the leader no one saw. And anyone present would never forget that moment. Because it's not about shouting loudly, it's about shouting right. And she shouted with the authority of someone who bears scars where others carry diplomas. Comment below. Have you ever seen someone transform an environment with a single action or word? While everyone ran in circles, screaming, slamming doors, losing control, and searching for leaders who had already succumbed to the chaos, she remained there, motionless, observant, as if she already knew the outcome before the tragedy even began. Not because she was cold, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already prepared herself in silence. While others slept in illusory safety, she studied. While they mocked her curiosity about maps, evacuation routes, forgotten protocols, and backup systems, she memorized every corridor, every emergency exit, every inch of that place. She wasn't an officer, she wasn't high-ranking, but she was the only one with a complete plan, and that now made her indispensable. The collapse began with silence. First the sensors failed, then the alarms. Then the control tower went silent. The hierarchy sank at the first scream of panic, and it was at that precise moment that she moved. Not as someone reacting, but as someone who had already decided what to do weeks before. She walked to the wall, where an old evacuation panel had been scratched with red paint by mistake, or perhaps out of fear, and unlocked it with a code only she knew. It was the same number that appeared at the bottom of a technical manual ignored by everyone, but which she had memorized out of pure habit. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't look for someone who couldn't lead. She simply began to act. With a firm voice, fixed eyes, and a calm almost unsettling to anyone watching her, she plotted the route. She had memorized the likely structural collapse points based on the latest weathering reports, cross-referenced ventilation information with emergency access, and, most unbelievably, had already prepared emergency kits at strategic points days before, disguised as extra stock. She hadn't expected to be overheard, but now everyone was running where she told them. Some hesitated. Others scoffed until the last second. But when they saw the corridors begin to crumble exactly as she had predicted, respect didn't come as a gift. It came as a necessity. Amid the smoke, the faulty sirens, and the erratic flashing sensors, she kept a steady hand. She assigned tasks, rearranged formations, and improvised means of communication with old wires and handheld flashlights. Everything she had learned in silence now became the only collective hope. The route was risky. It passed through abandoned areas of the complex, which everyone had considered obsolete. But she knew the risk was lower there. The structure was old, yes, but more solid. And most importantly, it wasn't part of the standard evacuation protocols. This meant no one would ever attempt to go that way, which made the route safer and less congested. She didn't just have a plan. She had the only plan that still worked. And then a dilemma arose. A group was trapped in one of the farthest blocks. Time was tight. Logic dictated that they should press on and save those already on their way to the exit. But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a small makeshift radio, left precise instructions for those remaining, and deviated from the plan she had devised to save those forgotten. It wasn't empty heroism. It was conviction. It was the awareness that her leadership depended not on the number of survivors, but on the integrity with which she conducted each step. Upon her return, with the rescued men in hand, she saw something she would never forget. The mental map she had constructed was now scribbled in soldiers' pockets, on screens improvised with dust and fingers in the murmured conversations between those who no longer shouted but obeyed. She no longer needed to repeat orders. The plan had become a legacy. She had become the point of balance. Everything that had seemed like silent quirks turned out to be preparation. What they called exaggeration became a lifeline. Invisibility gave way to natural leadership. and those who had previously ignored her now copied her steps. In the final stretch, when the light of the corridor leading to the surface was already in sight, some still didn't understand how she had known so much, how she had created something so functional, without support, without a position, without prior recognition. The answer was simple. She didn't expect anyone to grant her power. She built it with knowledge, strategy, study, and silence. She didn't need to pound the table. It was enough to show that her mind was sharper than any obsolete protocol. Amidst the collective panic, it was her internal structure that guided everyone to freedom. With the chaos now far behind and the survivors safe, the inevitable question arose: how did she know everything? How did she have time? How did she foresee failures that even the engineers couldn't imagine? What few knew was that, behind that ever-observant expression, there was someone who held secrets not out of ego but out of preparation. The truth is, she was the plan, and the plan that only she knew saved them all. Now tell me, would you follow someone like that if the world started to crumble around you? Comment below if you'd trust your life to someone who, even unnoticed, prepared themselves while everyone else slept. They marched through rubble, mud, snow, and fear. The discipline that had previously been maintained by hierarchy was now sustained by a voice, not a voice of command, but of lucidity. And the most shocking thing wasn't the respectful silence that formed around her, but the contrast with the recent past. Until a few days ago, she was the shadow no one noticed, the presence that generated hushed jokes in the corridors, the invisible of the battalion. Now every step she took was followed as if it were a map drawn for survival. The echo of her orders, which had previously been ignored or even ignored, now dictated the rhythm of their only chance of staying alive. The scene was grotesquely ironic. Generals bowed their heads beside her, asking for instructions with eyes hollowed with pride. Men who wore insignia and decades of military glory, now with faces etched with fear and trembling hands, depended on someone who wasn't even called by name. She was just the radio girl, the support technician, the young woman who passed on reports without being heard. But that day, after the collapse of structures, communications, and formal leadership, when the commander fell and the base fragmented into blind chaos, she stood up. Literally. She rose amid the smoke, amidst debris and screams, and used an emergency radio as if she were at home. And her voice didn't shout, it guided. The march that now advanced along the alternative route, away from the avalanche and contamination, only existed because she had silently memorized the evacuation maps in the unknown early mornings. She had always been there, but no one saw her, except now. Now it was impossible to ignore her, and the irony of fate fell like a fine, steady rain on the helmets of those who had once laughed at the way she spoke softly, how she avoided confusion, how she isolated herself. They mocked her introspection, but it was precisely this attentive silence that saved them all. The old colonel, who had once publicly interrupted her saying, "Let the men handle this," now walked behind her, breathing heavily and his morale crushed. He no longer gave orders. He merely confirmed hers, and what burned him inside wasn't just the error of judgment, but the fact that, at no point, had she humiliated him in return. There was no revenge in her eyes. There was focus, purpose. While others fell into arguments or collapsed emotionally, she stood, calculating, adjusting plans, calming the wounded, calling on the radio, reorienting troops, retrieving lost codes. What was most disconcerting was that she hadn't changed. Her posture was still restrained, her gaze still firm but without arrogance. What had changed was the perception of others. The truth, which had always been there, was now undeniable. And this dismantled the ego of those who built their identities on illusions of power. Her leadership was natural, instinctive, but based on preparation. There was no luck involved. There was study, listening, observation. She was the kind of person who enters a room silently, but leaves with everyone trailing behind. And now, literally, a line of soldiers walked through the underground passages thanks to the protocol she saved on a flash drive hidden in the hem of her uniform. Some tried to regain control. They tried to suggest shortcuts or forceful maneuvers. She listened to them all but followed what she knew. She didn't argue. She just walked. And as much as it irritated certain egos, it was impossible to confront the results. Each life spared reinforced what many still tried to deny. She was the pillar, the last fixed point amidst the collapse. And the most disturbing thing was realizing that, if it weren't for the chaos, they probably never would have seen it. Stories spread as they marched. One group told how she had secured a structure on the verge of collapse with wire. Another claimed she knew the exact location of the hidden reserves because she silently reviewed the arsenal's files on her days off. One soldier swore he heard her whisper the exact storm forecast before the radar confirmed it. "She's strange," some said. "She's precise," others corrected. But deep down everyone knew, without her no one would be there, and the most disturbing thing was admitting it without needing her to demand recognition. There was something profoundly poetic in that reversal. Those who had spoken most now only listened. Those who had scorned now depended. Those who had humiliated now expressed gratitude. And she, without needing to change her tone of voice, led a journey no other could have sustained. Chaos exposed hidden value. And this march, made by weary feet and transformed hearts, was living proof that time reveals everything, including those who truly deserve to be heard from the beginning. What about you? Have you ever stopped to think about how many times you ignored someone who, in the end, was exactly the person who could have saved you? Comment below if this story made you reflect on something you've experienced. The iron door closed behind them with a dry thud, muffled by the thick walls of the shelter. Outside, chaos still raged, biting winds, collapsing structures, distant screams. But inside, everything ceased. The silence was almost sacred, broken only by the sound of each person's breathing, as if for the first time they were aware of their own breath. They were alive, and this was only because of her. The minds of many there still couldn't process what had just happened. They had defied orders, followed an unknown route, traversed a dangerous and unlikely trail, leaving behind the calculations of experts and the comfort of mechanical certainties. They had followed the voice of someone who, until just a few hours earlier, hadn't even been heard in the meetings. Her, the one seen as too young, too weak, too timid. But at the moment, everyone lost their way. She was the one who knew exactly where to step. Some looked around the underground room, noticing details that confirmed this place wasn't improvised. There was storage, an autonomous ventilation system, emergency lighting, heat sensors, and old records on the panels. It wasn't a random cavern, it was a strategic point, secretly constructed decades ago. But how did she know this? How, among so many maps, simulations, and training sessions, had no one ever mentioned this place? Yet she, silently, led the group to it with disconcerting confidence. "How did she know?" muttered one of the lieutenants, his eyes still wide, covered in soot and snow. The sergeant who had once disbelieved her now clutched his helmet with both hands, staring at the ground, as if trying to recalculate the choices that had led him to doubt. Why didn't anyone ever see this in her? A nurse wondered aloud, still shocked by the memory that it was that young woman who had insisted on taking the medical kits on the train. "Why did we doubt her?" whispered another soldier, his voice choked, as if that question hurt him more than the cold of the mission. There was something almost sacred about that moment. It wasn't just the arrival at the shelter, it was the confrontation with each person's ego. Those who had always shouted were now silent. Those who had stood at the forefront were now behind. And she, who had walked alone through the hallways, was now at the center, but not by imposition, by necessity. Her past silence now echoed with authority. Everyone there knew, if it weren't for her, they would be dead. She didn't get worked up. She didn't say, "I told you so," nor did she seek the recognition many were already rushing to give her. She sat by the wall watching everyone enter, counting the wounded, checking supplies. She didn't want applause, she wanted reassurance that everyone was there. Her leadership was different. It didn't come from rank, it came from dedication. It didn't come from shouting, it came from precision, and now everyone saw it with their own eyes. What bothered some most was the fact that she didn't need to change to lead. She didn't shout, she didn't impose, she didn't reinvent herself to become acceptable. She remained true to her nature, and it was precisely this invisible steadfastness that saved everyone. It wasn't by chance. It was because, amidst the collapse, she was the only one who didn't tremble. Many began to relive moments, when she studied old maps that no one read, when she spent hours alone in the base archives, when she requested permission to explore areas that seemed irrelevant to the commanders. Everything was there, but no one wanted to see it, because it was easier to follow the strong, the noisy, the traditional. And today, in the shelter, it was impossible to deny the invisible had become indispensable. And then, for the first time, some understood that it had never been about luck, intuition, or chance. She had prepared herself, in silence, in anonymity, without needing validation at every step. She carried convictions while others collected applause. She took notes while others spoke. She observed where no one else was looking. And so, when everything fell apart, she was the only one who knew the way. Some wept, not out of fear, but out of shame. Shame at having been disbelieved, at having been laughed at, whispered about, ignored. Shame at realizing their lives were saved thanks to the very thing they had tried so hard to reduce. And now, in the fragile warmth of that shelter, they were all faced with reality. If there is a true definition of leadership, it was there, sitting with calloused hands and alert eyes. And perhaps most profound of all was realizing that, even in the face of collective error, she didn't abandon them. Even though she could have let them get lost, even though she was humiliated and ignored, she chose to be the path. Because she didn't do what she did out of vanity. She did it out of mission. That underground room wasn't just a shelter from the destruction outside. It was the scene of the collapse of egos, the birth of a new silent hierarchy where merit wasn't shouted, it was proven. And she proved it, without seeking to prove it. Comment here. At what point in your life have you been underestimated, but saved everything anyway? When the storm subsided and silence descended on what remained of the base, the first sensation wasn't relief. It was strangeness. Because after so much noise, so much tension, so much running around and shouted orders amidst the chaos, the silence seemed wrong. But there it was, dense, almost sacred. It was as if time had stopped to observe what was left and who was still standing. The rubble still smoldered. The smell of burnt metal lingered in the air. But something had changed profoundly. The looks in their eyes. The soldiers who had previously avoided her, who hadn't even mentioned her in meetings or during battles, now regarded her with an almost reverential respect. One of them, who had openly ignored her in the corridors, offered her water. Another, who had once accused her of scaremongering, stopped in front of her and nodded, his eyes moist. But she didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't seize the moment to apologize. There was no thirst for revenge on her face, only a serenity that disturbed the proud and healed the humble. Her presence in that place now screamed even when she said nothing. Because true respect never needs an announcement, it imposes itself in silence. The fallen commander was the last to face her. His expression was confused, as if reviewing his entire history in a few seconds. He blinked slowly, swallowed hard, and although he tried to maintain his leadership posture, his fragility was evident, because at the most critical moment, it was the one he least considered who kept the base alive. And that kind of truth cannot be ignored for long. When he tried to say something, she merely nodded, as if to say, "I know," and she turned her face away. Not out of contempt, but because her mission was not to prove anything to anyone. While some cleaned the hallways, others took inventory of the damage. But she walked silently toward room 7, the one she discovered amidst the collapse, the one that hid truths that could have saved lives before the tragedy. No permission was needed. No one stopped her. For the first time, she wasn't a questioned presence. She was a safe path. Each step she took in that hallway carried the weight of a story that would never be told in war manuals. It was the kind of event that only survivors recognize with their eyes. A silent but powerful language. An old radio still emitted faint interference. It was that same radio that, in her most desperate moments, had transmitted her voice. That voice that had been ignored for days until it was the only one left. And now, he remained there, a silent witness to everything that had happened. She sat before him, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. There was no jubilation, no glory. There was peace. The peace of knowing she did the right thing, even when disbelieved by everyone. Outside, the sky was still cloudy, but the wind had changed. It was no longer the biting wind that threatened to topple structures. It was a warm breeze, almost like a whisper of nature recognizing the courage of those who stood when everyone else crumbled. She lifted her face for a second, as if listening to something invisible. Perhaps it was just the sound of her own heart beating with the tranquility of someone who had conquered, not others but herself, because the greatest battlefield has always been within. No one dared interrupt her solitude. It was as if that moment were inviolable. Everyone, even the toughest, knew that there was a warrior there who didn't need to shout, order, or impose herself brutally. She won in silence. She won with firmness, with strategy, with discernment. And the world, which had previously seen her as invisible, now saw her as essential. But she didn't need that. Her soul had already resolved itself. The wreckage would be cleared. The base would be rebuilt. The commander might return to his post, might not. But what no one could erase was what was imprinted that day. A discredited woman saved everyone and demanded nothing in return. That memory would live on in the corridors, on the walls, in secret reports, and in the silent prayers of those who returned home. She stood. He glanced at the door to room 7 again and locked it with his own hands. Some truths don't need to be revealed. It's enough that they were used for good at the right time. Then he walked to the medical bay, where some wounded soldiers were recovering. One of them smiled. She simply nodded, and once again he returned to his silence. But this time the silence wasn't solitude. It was reverence, it was a response. It was the invisible signature of someone who knows the world doesn't need to applaud you for you to fulfill your purpose. Now tell me in the comments with one sentence, have you also had to overcome in silence? She had no prestigious uniform, nor a voice in the strategy meetings. She was the shadow in the corner of the mess hall, the ignored presence on the training ground, the figure everyone considered the weakest, the most inexperienced, the one who couldn't handle a real mission. But on that base, where the screams fell silent and the weak fell, she remained standing, not out of pride nor a thirst for applause, but because within her lay something human eyes could not measure: faith, conviction, instinct trained in silence, strength refined in contempt. As the generals shouted confusing orders and the soldiers ran in circles, she listened. She watched. She measured every sound, every shadow, every movement. She knew that this chaos wasn't the end. It was the beginning of opportunity. A chance to show that courage doesn't shout, it acts. That leadership isn't imposed by shouting, it reveals itself in crisis. And so, in the midst of collapse, she didn't wait for permission. She took control with the one command no one expected: a shout. But it wasn't a cry of despair. It was the kind of sound that breaks through arrogance and silences doubt, a cry that arose from the spirit of someone who had endured being ignored for too long. It was in this cry that the new escape route was born, the precise order, the logistical miracle. The base, which had previously been a mass of armed egos, became a crowd following a single voice, hers, and there was no resistance. None of those who had previously mocked her dared question her. Because when a true leader stands up, even pride bows its head. She guided the wounded, calmed the desperate, saved lives, and restored what remained of dignity in that mission. She did so without demanding credit, without explaining herself, without needing recognition. At the most critical moment, the wounded commander looked at her not with authority, but with respect, and the same soldiers who had laughed at her discreet posture now copied her steps exactly. She was the one who knew the route. She was the one who had predicted the electrical system failure. She was the one who, alone, studied the old maps of the base and memorized every alternative exit. All in silence. All invisibility. Now, in the base's reconstructed corridors, there's a new whisper among the recruits. Did you hear about her? The one who saved everyone when no one knew what to do. The one no one believed in? Her name isn't yet on the honor plaques, but her story circulates in the glances, the respectful pauses, the impressed whispers. She's become a living legend, not because she's unbeatable, but because she overcame the impossible with something most would never understand: purpose. While others sought medals, she sought meaning. While they screamed to be heard, she plotted in silence. And when Judgment Day arrived, she was undaunted. She simply acted. She did what no one else had the courage to do. She broke through the barrier of fear with wisdom, precision, and faith. Her strength wasn't the kind that impressed in training, but the kind that sustained her through collapse. Today, as they pass her in the courtyard, many look away, not out of contempt, but out of embarrassment. They know they were wrong to doubt, and she knows she doesn't need to demand anything. Reality itself will take care of justice. And yet, she remains discreet. She doesn't boast. She doesn't change her tone. She doesn't flaunt. Because those who know their worth don't need to convince anyone. They just need to keep being who they are. And if you think this is all just a story of overcoming, you're wrong. It's a reminder, a mirror, a provocation for your own journey. How many times have you been underestimated, ignored, ridiculed for not fitting in? And how many times have you let this define you? The truth is, most people only realize their strength after you transform it into a legacy. And maybe it's time for you to stop trying to prove it too, and start just doing, like she did. If this moment touched you, like it now and subscribe to the channel, because in the next video, you'll discover how silence can be the most lethal weapon when everything falls apart.